Welcome to Scrolling to Death. Today I'm here with Karl Stillner, who is the co-founder and CEO of BrightCanary, which is a resource that helps parents engage and prepare their kids for their digital lives. So, hey, Karl, thank you for being here today.
Thanks for having me, Nikki.
Of course. And I was reviewing your bio. You are an entrepreneur many times over. Can you just give me your story? What led you to create this resource for parents?
Yeah, so I'm a longtime tech entrepreneur. I've been working in the mobile app space for well over a decade at this point. And so I have a lot of experience with mobile. And during my last startup, my co-founder and I, who happens to be the same co-founder I have with this startup, we were both lamenting the fact that we had kids, and he has twins, and I have a 12-year-old and 9-year-old. And we were lamenting the fact that there's really not any kind of tech solutions we thought were appropriate for raising kids in the digital age. It felt like parents had been a little left flat-footed, so to speak, during COVID. There was this huge acceleration in terms of device use, and there wasn't really a commensurate acceleration in technologies for parents. And so we talked about this a lot in the hallway during our last startup. And when we exited that business and were looking for another business to start, we went back to this idea and said, well, let's take a spin at it. And it's very different. You know, I haven't been working in the consumer space at all. This is my first consumer startup. Everything else has been B2B before this. So it's a new beast for us to tackle, but we think it's an important one. And having 12-year-old and 9-year-old, like I said, at home really helps me because I'm the target customer. So I can really relate to the product very closely.
Yeah, for sure. So, and you mentioned you had identified that there were no devices on the market that were sort of appropriate for kids. Or are we referring to mostly iPhones? I mean, a lot of parents over this last decade have been handing their kids iPhones. Do you feel that an iPhone is safe for children?
Well, so first of all, it didn't exactly mean devices. I probably should have said services. We didn't feel like there were services that were designed for parents. And by that, I mean services that help parents understand what their kids were doing in the digital world. And so what had been kind of the option set was one, which is a hands-off approach, which is hand over the device for upwards of 6 hours a day these days and hope it works out. And it works out fine for some kids, and it does not work out well for other kids. And on the other end of the spectrum was this kind of control the device, lock it down, prevent the kids from kind of any exposure whatsoever, which one didn't seem very realistic in today's day and age where kids have access to devices at school, at their friends' houses, etc.
Yeah, and they can get around anything you try to put on there in many cases.
Totally. It's a cat and mouse game that the parents ultimately usually lose because the kids have a lot more time and smarts when it comes to this. And so we wanted to forge a middle path, and that pertains to devices, but more specifically around services for parents. And so getting back to your original question around iPhones, iPhones are supercomputers, right? They're incredibly powerful. They have access to hundreds of thousands of services. And so it's really what kids do with those devices. I mean, I quite frankly think it's a little bit of overkill for kids. I don't think they need a smartphone or a supercomputer in their pocket. The reality is that 85% plus of teenage kids in the US have iPhones. So that's the reality we're dealing with. And so we designed a service for iPhone because that's where the kids are.
Right. And I do get comments almost daily because I tend to hate on the iPhone for kids. But we get comments saying parents love the parental controls, and they feel that they're able to really monitor what their kids are doing on the iPhone with Apple's parental controls. Do you agree with that?
No, I think the screen time controls in Apple are really good at limiting quantity of interactions and types of interactions. So I'm going to set this amount of time for this particular app, or I'm going to block this particular app. And they do a pretty good job. A lot of the falling down is the complexity of it. It takes a lot of time to go in and actually understand how the screen time tools actually work. And I think most parents don't take the appropriate time and don't have the appropriate kind of guides. I think Apple does a great job of explaining to parents how to use these things. And so I think that's the biggest problem. But, we're focused on a different problem, which is the quality of content interaction. So focusing on what the kids are actually consuming, which screen time does not do. Screen time only provides quantity restrictions.
Yeah. And that's where a lot of those harms come in, is the types of content they're viewing or the people they're getting access to through some of these platforms.
That's right.
So let's back up. So you have a 9 and a 12-year-old. How are you keeping them safe in their experiences with devices?
It's a good question. And, I spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I still don't consider myself to be, have figured out the perfect solution here.
Me either, right. Yep. This is a hard one.
It's a hard one for sure. first thing we do is we have very transparent conversations with our kids about
Yeah.
what we think about services and devices and the ills. And fortunately, there's a lot more tools for parents now than there were even a few years ago. Watching something like The Social Dilemma with your kids, I think, should be required watching for anyone who's about to get a social media account.
What age do you feel like? I was just thinking about this yesterday. Is my almost 9-year-old old enough to watch that, or is it over her head? Every child is different. But
It depends on the child.
would you show your 9-year-old The Social Dilemma?
I would. And I wouldn't expect him to grok everything, but he
Right.
probably would get half of it and then maybe show it to him again in a couple of years. But my 12-year-old certainly gets it, and he's talking about it, and he's particularly savvy, and kids are savvy about this stuff. I mean, that's the good news story here, is that kids are much more aware of what's going on than they were even 3 years ago. And so this is part of their discussion set. They're being educated, even if it's kind of indirectly about this. I do think schools should be doing a better job of providing digital education around these things. But even if they're just hearing people talking about this, hearing their parents talk about it. But I think it's important for parents to have a pretty honest discussion about why they're concerned. Because I think if parents lay that foundation, it makes restrictions and any kind of constraints that are put on the kids a lot more palatable than if it's just done arbitrarily in the kid's mind, at least.
Right.
So we try and start with that. Neither one of them have phones, needless to say. They do both have iPads, and they do have access. They don't have any social media whatsoever, but they do have access to iMessage, at least a 12-year-old does, which in many ways is a form of social media, right?
Yeah.
It's not classified as such, but it's a way for them to communicate with friends in large group settings. They can share videos and photos, and there can be anonymous conversations, unfortunately, as well, which is a big part of our concern around that is, who are they chatting with on text. But we do think that's important for them to have that digital connection with their cousins, their soccer teammates, their classmates. And so we do allow that, but again, no social media. So that's a big part of it. And, we do put pretty strict restrictions on the amount of time they can spend on their iPads during the school week. We don't really allow it at all. On the weekends, we give them a block of time they can allocate over the 2 days.
Yeah.
But the thing we're struggling with the most right now is how to throttle consumption based on the quality of what they're viewing. Right. So my 9-year-old really likes watching science videos, and I don't want to restrict that. I think that should be something that's indulged. And so I don't want to say you can only view that for 30 minutes this weekend when, he may really want to spend 3 hours with it. But at the same time, how does that translate when my older son, who's really into sports, says, well, I should be able to watch a baseball game for 3 hours because my younger sibling is watching these science videos, and you're making a qualitative judgment on the type of content they're consuming, which is difficult.
Right. And they could be watching science videos, and then they get notifications from over here. They get pulled back and forth. So the distraction from whatever might be educational or productive is tough. Okay. Thank you for sharing that. And why don't we talk about schools really quick? Because you mentioned that schools aren't doing a great job with digital education. And I agree with that. Do your children have school-issued devices at school?
They do. They both have Chromebooks.
Okay. Did they bring them home?
They bring them home. And so that has become a workaround for not having any restrictions on their time, because they'll whip open their laptop, their Chromebook, and they'll be in their room, supposedly working on schoolwork, but they're really looking at, their fantasy football team or whatever. And so it's hard to know. And it's unfortunate that they've become such a huge part of the classroom, even for my 9-year-old. I think it's a little shocking that a 9-year-old should need to use a Chromebook to get educated at this, at this age. It just doesn't feel like it should be part of the toolkit this early. But it is, unfortunately.
Yeah, this is something we're really struggling with, because my 3-year-old, almost 4, so she still has another year of a preschool program, but then she'll go into TK, and I cannot imagine her, they give them in TK iPads. I can't imagine her using an iPad. She doesn't do a personal device. She's 3. So we're looking at completely different schools, because it can feel really like an uphill battle to try to opt out of the device use. Have you guys or any of the people you're around tried to opt out of maybe bringing them home or using them so much at school?
It's really difficult, because you're right. It feels like it's kind of ingrained into the academia,
Yeah.
the culture or the curriculum that is.
Yeah.
And so I haven't tried to change it for either one of them.
Mm-hmm.
Our younger one, the 9-year-old, doesn't seem to actually be drawn to it too much. So it hasn't been a problem for him. He's pretty limited in his consumption, even though he probably could use it a lot more. And for our 12-year-old, it feels like that's a total uphill battle to try and
Mm-hmm.
change that. I will say that, I think there is something to be said for starting to have parents organize around some of these issues now. I just read The Anxious Generation, as I'm sure you have as well.
Yeah. Yep.
And I think that there's some great points about collective action in that
Mm-hmm.
around, device-free schools. And my son's middle school does not have a device-free policy. They are not allowed to have the devices out of their pockets during the school day, but I know that kids are going in and texting during their bathroom breaks and things like that. And so
Right.
that is something I feel like I'm going to lead with in terms of
Mm-hmm.
talking to the administration about seeing if that can be changed.
Yeah, I think the phone-free schools is easier to accomplish than the whole school-issued device debacle.
Yes, that's right.
I'm digging into that in a dedicated episode because I just think there's a lot of research now that says they don't learn as well from a device as they do from the paper textbooks, and also just all the distractions. The schools aren't doing a great job of locking down those devices so that they stay focused. With you having a product that helps parents monitor our personal devices, do you feel like the school issued devices are being well monitored in your case, by the school district or whoever's monitoring
No.
there? No.
No,
Okay.
I think that there's certain districts that maybe doing it better than others, of course. But
Okay.
what I've seen is no, they're not doing a great job of it at all. It's unfortunate because then it becomes a workaround for a lot of kids. And our technology helps a little in that regard. So if a kid's logged into their Google account on their Chromebook, we still see all the searches and YouTube activity, and
Okay.
that can be provided to the parents. So we don't have to install software on it. So we feel like that's an area for us to kind of go after because, again, we hear from time and time again from parents who are frustrated around this. And there's also no feedback. Even if the schools are getting information, they're not providing it in any kind of consumable way to parents. It's only for the worst of worst situations.
And at my school, I was told by the tech guy that they're monitoring everything, but they don't get alerts of things. So basically, if the teacher is over the shoulder or notices something wrong, they can go back in the history and find it, but they're not getting alerts of the harmful content or grooming or whatever could be happening. So that was concerning to learn because you just assume that that's something that they are doing on our behalf.
Right. I think they're under-resourced, of course, and there's no monitoring tool that's perfect for this stuff. So it requires some kind of human oversight as well, which I think the parents are actually very well equipped to do versus, an administrator in a school where there's, a couple thousand students. Like it's not going to happen.
Right. Okay. Let's transition to social media. So I think some parents may assume that our kids are allowed to sign up at 13 to social media. So they must be keeping them safe, at that age. Do you feel that social media companies are keeping our kids safe?
No. I mean, I think that's thanks for the toss up. No, I think I think what the efforts to date have largely been PR driven. It's something to announce a few days before they're pulled in front of Congress to testify and the like. And I think it's challenging because, as many of the whistleblowers have pointed out, it's really hard for an industry to regulate itself in a way that's against its self-interest. Right? You can't expect big tobacco to regulate itself, and you can't expect social media to cut off its next generation of users. And so that's what we're hoping for them to do with this self-regulation notion. And so I think the efforts to date, they have implemented some features, but even when they do implement features that are designed to help parents and help kids navigate this, they're not promoted in any way. And so, I talk to parents all the time about technology use. I don't think I've talked to any parent who's using any of these controls on Facebook, for example, or Instagram.
Right.
They just don't use them.
Yeah. I think Snapchat, it's 1% of parents use the parental control area.
Right.
And sometimes I feel like the updates for child safety are kind of overstated when they're actually just very minimal changes that should have been there in the first place. But when you say PR driven, I mean, I don't know if you caught Snapchat's expose or the expose on Snapchat's drug trade in Rolling Stone early last week, maybe 2 weeks ago. And then within about 8-9 days, they released a big update to all their safety features. And I'm going through it with an attorney tomorrow to kind of dig into if she feels that it's actually going to keep kids safer. But yeah, a lot of this is PR driven. It's in response to something that is being pointed out that's bad on their platform. It's not proactive in protecting our children. The social media companies are not keeping our kids safe. Is there legislation that you're aware of that is currently keeping our kids safe online? Like if our kids are harmed on social media, can we go after the social media companies to hold them liable?
Yeah. So a couple things. I mean, the only piece of legislation that exists right now is something that was passed a few decades ago, called COPPA, which is really designed to prevent kids from getting profiled for advertising purposes. And it's the age threshold is 13, which is, not coincidentally why the cutoff for social media companies has been 13 as well. It's based on COPPA. But that's the only piece of legislation that has passed since the internet's inception that is designed to protect kids, which I think is really quite sad. We have this extremely vulnerable and this population that has undeveloped prefrontal cortexes, right? They don't know how to self-regulate themselves in any way, which is why there's laws against tobacco, age thresholds for tobacco, for gambling, for alcohol, for driving, for voting. But there isn't one for use of these products, which are quite addictive in many ways.
Yep.
And so we're in favor of all legislation that is designed to help protect kids around this, even if it's against the interest of BrightCanary. Ultimately, we think it's the best thing. So we don't think kids should have access to social media before 16, for example. And
Great. Thank you for putting a number on it.
yeah. So I think that's a reasonable age. It's been supported by some research, of course. And so and I know there's a bunch of legislation that's kind of stalled right now in DC, unfortunately. We've been part of some of that, specifically around Sammy's bill. But COSA seems to have stalled as well, which is unfortunate because we think any of these things will be a step in the right direction.
Right. And, on the harsh end, we are losing children by the day to social media harms, something related to social media. So it's really important as an understatement. When you talk about COPPA, the big tech companies consistently violate COPPA. So TikTok, FTC, or one of the federal commissions is starting a lawsuit against TikTok now because they violated COPPA. So, and then Kids Online Safety Act is an important one that is stalled, but has 70 co-sponsors in the Senate, bipartisan. So a message I try to share with all parents is call your senators, message them on their website, or your representatives in the House, and tell them to pass COSA because it's been sitting. Okay, so social media companies aren't keeping our kids safe. Legislation is stalled. It feels like it's just up to parents. And so what's the best way for parents to keep our kids safe on their devices?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with that. I think no one cares about kids' mental health and safety more than their parents, period. That's the most important fact here. Social media won't, government won't. And so I think parents need to realize that if their kids are going to be using these services, they need to be playing a very proactive role in that. They need to be parenting. You wouldn't drop off your kid downtown and let them walk around for 3 hours without having some kind of oversight in terms of what they're doing. It's the same thing in the digital world. And so we feel pretty strongly that parents should stay apprised of their kids' activities with a caveat that this needs to be age driven, right? So an 8-year-old is very different than a 16-year-old. And so we need to have nuance to this. And I think that's been missing as part of this conversation as well, is anyone under 18 has been treated as a minor for this industry in particular. Whereas there's a very different set of needs for parents of an 8-year-old versus parents of a 16-year-old. And I think that needs to be built into the technology solutions. And so I think the first thing the parents can do is get informed about what's going on, where their kids are spending time, so they can have conversations and have transparency as well. We think that there should be an open dialogue around what the kids are doing online. And the unfortunate reality is that what happens online is oftentimes really cordoned off from conversations. I've noticed that in my dialogue with the kids. Like they'll talk about what Johnny did on the playground, but they won't talk about what happened in a video game they were playing, a social video game, or any kind of interactions that happen on text message. They just don't talk about it. It's like a different world, and so it makes it even more difficult for parents to actually have any kind of parenting ability.
Yeah, interesting. that solo device time does just feel separated for them, not
It
something
does.
to
Yeah.
be shared. And social media platforms in general, they encourage anonymity and they make, things disappear. You have an avatar, like they
That's right.
try to make it feel like a private experience for you only, which
That's right.
is the opposite of what parents want, is our kids to be sharing how they're feeling about their online activities.
That's right.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, so we think that's a big part of it, and again, it's parents when they hand over a device to an 8-year-old, our feeling is that they should be locking that device down and understanding everything the 8-year-old's doing. And what's interesting about that is that kids actually want that. What we've learned is that
Mm-hmm.
8 to 10, maybe 11 in certain cases, the
Mm-hmm.
kids want that security blanket. They know, they've heard the internet's a dangerous place,
Mm-hmm.
and they want their parents' oversight for the most part. And so there's no friction with our 9-year-old when he's using his device. He wants us to know what's going on. He has
Mm-hmm.
zero notion of privacy at
Mm.
all. Now that changes around the age of 12,
Yeah.
right? And so then the products that are available for parents need to change as well. And so that a 13-year-old can have some notion of privacy while the
Yeah.
parents have some ability to still understand what's going on. Right. And that's
Mm-hmm.
challenging to do. But the good news is that AI is making that a lot easier for technology solutions to develop around.
Yeah. And so what's the balance between monitoring and giving them their privacy, let's say for like a 16-year-old?
Every kid's different, of course, and there's situations like, well, we have communications with parents all the time. I had one last week where there was a 16-year-old who was getting stalked by a drug dealer on Snapchat. And so the drug dealer was pushing drugs on a 16-year-old. And we always lead with, well, your kid's 16, you should be providing transparency to the kid. And like, well, my child's got a drug substance abuse problem, is being stalked by a drug dealer. And so what do you say to that situation? Right. So every one of these situations is unique. I'll lead with that. But in general, we think that as the kid gets older into the preteen, later, 12, 13, 14, pulling back on understanding everything the kid is saying, right? And so what we're doing in our product right now is we'll run all the communications in a text message exchange, for example, through an AI model. And we'll provide a summary to the parent saying, hey, this is the type of thing that's being discussed. There's talk of baseball or football game or whatever it may be. And if there's things like there's self-harm or there's eating disorder talk, we'll flag that so that the parent can actually understand that without actually going in and reading every communication. Then, of course, if some of these things are tripped, if there is some concerning content, then the parent might want to opt in to go read the full transcript of everything that's been said, not have that as a default. And so we can sit down with our son and say, we're not going to read everything you say with your friends. You're not going to see everything that's said back and forth, but we will know if something is really objectionable that's going on. And so to us, that feels like a graduated way of kind of moving out of that, 8 to 11-year-old range into the teenage years.
Yeah, totally. How do you stay on top of the fact that kids will often use like code words for different things? I know on social media, like they call a drug dealer a plug, and it took a while, I think, for Snapchat to catch on. They're still not doing a good job flagging that, but yeah. So how does your AI keep up with the fact that the teens know they're being tracked for harmful things and they're smart? They'll try to figure out code words for it.
Yeah. No, there's always going to be holes, of course, that can be exploited. But again, AI has the potential to help train models that are aware of the lingo that kids are using for whatever it may be, right? So the only way we're going to be able to actually figure out what the latest lingo is by using hundreds of thousands, millions of transcripts of conversations and train the models based on this and say, okay, we can understand how this is being described now. Because otherwise, I think it's a losing battle. It has to be driven by scale.
And that can happen very quickly. So maybe they're all starting to pick up on a new term and the AI will kind of put it together. Okay, that's cool. Do you feel like generally parents are going overboard though when it comes to monitoring our younger kids? I see a lot of little kids with watches, 5, 6, 7-year-olds. A lot of times those watches, parents can just listen in to what their kid's doing all the time and contact them at any time. Do you feel like we've gone a little too far with monitoring?
Yeah, I do feel we've gone too far in real world monitoring.
Yeah.
letting your child not wander beyond the first few steps of your house. I mean, I think there's a lot of value in developing independence and autonomy and kind of a sense of the broader world by running around the neighborhood is an easy example that I think most of us experienced in our childhood. And we as parents are trying to foster that where they can run around the neighborhood. And yes, there is a small risk that there's a child predator, but we've all seen the statistics on that. Like you're much more likely to get hit by a car than to be abducted by a child abductor or something like that. So the chances are very low. And so I think that's kind of part of the problem is we become overprotective in the real world. And so we've driven kids indoors. And then, of course, what do they do if they're driven indoors is they're going to spend all their time on the device because it's a really attractive form of entertainment. It's designed to hook kids with, all kinds of behavioral tricks, behavioral psychology tricks.
Yeah.
And so I believe, as many others do as well, that we're underprotecting in the digital world and overprotecting in the offline world or the real world.
Yeah, I agree. Just yesterday morning, my kids, we were waiting for someone to come over. They went out in the front yard and there was a window open. I could hear them, but then they went next door. And I'm thinking like, that's the first time we have a neighborhood with a lot of older people. There's not a lot of kids, but they went next door to where there are kids and I could hear them, but I couldn't see them at all. And I just thought I resisted the need to like go out and keep my eye on them. I mean, they're right next door. I know there are parents over there as well. So I think that can feel uncomfortable for me. When I grew up, we would just like run around the neighborhood completely free. So it's crazy how much that's changed in one short generation.
And I will say, from our experience is that you do it a few times and then you get used to it. You're like, okay, I can understand how this works. And especially the like-minded parents and they're kind of all looking out for the kids in the neighborhood. There's something kind of community driven by it as well, which is, I think, a nice thing for kids to be aware of as well. And that's missing in today's day and age, of course, as well.
Yeah. Let's start to wrap up, but I want to ask about device choices. So when it is time to give your child a device, do you have ones that are that you will go to with your kids when they're ready for a device?
I think that as a first step, there's plenty of kind of dumb phones now. There's flip phones you can get on any carrier. There are the kind of the Android safe phones. There's Bark, Gab, and Pinwheel have devices as well that are kind of very limited in their functionality.
Yeah.
Personally, what we'll do is we'll go to a watch first because that provides text messaging and phone calling, which is what we're concerned about as easy way to communicate with a child. So that's what will probably be our first device for our kids, and then. Ultimately, I think when they're in high school is probably when they'll get, smartphone devices. And I think it's going to be hard for us to argue against an iPhone. Again, 95%, right? Or 85% of kids have iPhones. And so you don't want your kid to be stigmatized by it in high school.
Yeah. And I mean, the Bark phones and the Pinwheels, they are Samsung phones. So they don't look like little kid phones, but they are not iPhones. And when you have 95% of kids and kids get really catty about the types of devices and products that they use, I think, in high school.
Well, and just to dig a little deeper on that, the reason why I think it's important is, a lot of the text message exchanges are how social media manifests for a lot of kids, especially those who have been prevented from going on social media. And the Android phones and the flip phones do not allow you to interoperate the same way, right? So you cannot add an Android phone to an iOS group text message right now. There's going to be some changes. RCS is coming, so there's going to be some changes to this in the fall, but there's still going to be some interoperability issues between Android and iOS. And so, again, that's what kids care about. They want to feel included. And if they're getting them a device so they can feel like they're part of a community, and then they're not really part of the community, feels like you're not really solving either of the problems.
Yeah. Or you could get together with your kids, friends, parents, and be like, let's all get them a Bark phone or let's all get them a Pinwheel phone. And then they all have the same thing, could work.
I think that's very realistic for elementary and maybe middle school. I don't think it's realistic for high school at all.
Okay. Not yet. Maybe in 10 years.
Maybe it's tough. Apple's the largest company in the world, and that's a marketing machine. So I don't think Apple's going away anytime soon. And so there's always hope, but there's always hope that there'll be other solutions that kids want. But for now, we're living in an iOS world.
Yeah. it's just hard because those phones were built for adults and they are built
Yes.
fully loaded, right? So then we now have these kids safe phones that were built for kids and they come bare. So you have to add the stuff on top
Right.
in order for them to access it. So, but I think we're just really new in that whole transition. So
Yeah.
it's early. I
And
get
hopefully
that.
Apple starts taking this more seriously too,
Yeah.
right? Like
I
screen
know.
time has some excellent features in it, right? And so Apple
Mm.
is very well equipped to be a leader in this space. And so they very well could do this in the future. Who knows? It's hard to say.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Let's put that out there in the
Yes.
ether. Okay. Anything else you want to share with parents who are listening about Bright Canary or about your work? Anything?
No, I mean, I think this is this is obviously very important. Thank you for the work you do in this space. I think it's important for parents to be educated about this. And
Mm-hmm.
I think, the good news is I think people are now taking notice. And,
Yeah.
3 or 5 years ago, felt like there was very little awareness. And now we're past the awareness phase. And I think we're now into the solutions phase. So how do we actually
Mm-hmm.
address this? So it's
Yeah.
exciting.
Good. Thank you for being part of the solution and for helping to keep our kids safe online. So, on behalf of parents, we're just really grateful for you and your team at Bright Canary. Thank you, Karl.
Well, thank you, Nikki. Appreciate
You're
it.
welcome. You're
Okay.
welcome.